Hi, this is Nathan Hedrick, pastor of Wayside Baptist Church in Anniston, Alabama. I want to welcome you to our video this week, and we're going to continue with the series that we've been doing on people from the Bible and looking at different people in their lives, how God used them, that sort of thing. This week, I want to look at David. David was the most prominent person mentioned in the Bible. I was looking this up, and in the Bible, there are more chapters about David than there are about any other person. David has 66 chapters that mention him or about him, and the next closest one would be Abraham and Joseph as a tie. They both have 14 each. So you can see it's an overwhelming number of chapters that are more so about David than anybody else. And so I think there's a reason why, because God said that David was a man after his own heart, and there were some things that were wrong with David, of course, but God still used David mightily and in a huge way, and there's a lot of things that we can learn from David and the life that he lived. So in Acts chapter 13 and verse 22 is where it says that about David being a man after his own heart. It says, "I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, which shall fulfill all my will." So God had a plan for David, and God has a plan for all of us. But he had a plan for David, and he was going to be faithful to do it. And we see later that David made some mistakes and did some things and all, but David did accomplish what God wanted him to accomplish, and then he left the rest of it for Solomon, who would come after him. And again, just like a lot of the stories that we've been looking at over the past few weeks, this is another story where God is in the background orchestrating everything that's happening, and he's using faithful people, he's using unfaithful people, he's using everybody in this story to accomplish his will, whether they realize that or not. Even Goliath. That's the most common thing that we know about David is Goliath and how he killed the giant. But David, God was using David, God was using Saul, and God was using Goliath all to make this story happen. But before we get to that, just some of David's early life. David was born approximately 5 years after King Saul began his reign in 1035 BC. Here's something else that was kind of interesting that I had not really read before this week, but David was the great-grandson of Ruth and Boaz. And I've never really looked at that, but Ruth chapter 4, verse 21 and 22, it says, "And Salmon begat Boaz, and Boaz begat Obed, Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David." So we see that he was the great-grandson of Ruth and Boaz, who were both greatly used in the Bible, and Boaz was a very prominent man. So we think David probably didn't grow up poor. He probably grew up, decently well off, if not very well off, because we know Boaz was a kinsman redeemer back in the story of Ruth, and so he had to have money to do that, and he had fields, and it says that Ruth was working in his fields. So we know that he was a prominent citizen in the time. So we think that probably David was too. David was the youngest of 8 boys, and possibly a good bit younger. We see that he was a shepherd boy, but while David was a shepherd boy at home keeping the sheep, all his other brothers were off in the army fighting for King Saul. So possibly he was a good bit younger than the older brothers, maybe a child that was had late in life. In 1025 BC, we see that David was anointed to become the king of Israel due to Solomon's disobedience. God had given Solomon some instructions. Solomon chose to do something else, and God chose to take the kingdom away from Saul and give it to someone else. However, it wasn't told to David when he would become king. It was just, hey, you're going to be the next one. Samuel anointed him, and that was it. And then it was kind of left like that for some years, and he didn't know when or really how it was going to happen, just that it would at some point. Everyone thought that when Samuel came to town and was looking at Jesse and asking him for his sons, everybody thought that God would choose one of the older ones. They were the better looking ones. They were the warriors in the army. They were the, whatever. And God told Samuel something that was really interesting and something that kind of rang true throughout this whole story and throughout really the whole life of David. But he told Samuel, he said, don't look on the outward appearance. He says, I'm looking at the heart. So that was really, really important. But we see that God is looking at man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And then we see that the Spirit, once Samuel anointed David as the king, it says that the Spirit of the Lord left Saul and went to David. So Saul is no longer being blessed by God like he was before. He's no longer quite as close to God as he was before. And that threw off a lot of things in his life. And Saul didn't really recover from any of this. His life from this point forward is kind of the declining part of his life, so to speak. So the next thing we see in 1023 BC, keep in mind that time BC is traveling, from greater to smaller. So 1025, he's anointed to become king. 1023, which is 2 years later, he's asked to come into the palace and play his harp for King Saul. King Saul would have these spells where it says an evil spirit would trouble him. A lot of people speculate that that's some kind of a depression that he was in, or some kind of mental troubles that he had, or something like that. Don't really know. But they would call David to play the harp and play some music and get his mind off of whatever he was thinking of, and it would cheer him up. So David was kind of a court musician, if you will. This wasn't a full-time thing. This was just kind of one of those things that's done as needed. So whenever they needed David, they would call for him. He would come to the palace and do what he needed to do. Then after that, he would go home, go back to becoming, being a shepherd and watching the sheep. So that's kind of the earlier part of David's life. And then we move from that, we move over to the story about Goliath. And this is something that's familiar to all of us. I'm going to read this to you again, just because it's such a powerful story. Again, this is kind of a lot like some of the other things that we've studied, where everything that we studied in Sunday school as children, not exactly the same thing that we know of when we study the story in the Bible. We don't really get a lot of the details as children. But as adults, there's a lot of things that we really need to learn from a lot of these Bible characters that we're studying after. So in 1 Samuel chapter 17, it says, Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shoka, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shoka and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. There went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And one bearing a shield went before him. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are ye come out and set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine, and ye servants of Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. And if he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And when Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. And he had 8 sons. And the man went among the men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to battle. And the names of his 3 sons that went to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest. And the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening, and presented himself 40 days. And Jesse said unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. And Saul and they, all the men of Israel, were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to fight, and he shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hands of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army and saluted the brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words. And David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have ye seen this man that is come up? Surely to defile Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David spake unto the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know of thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightst see the battle. And David said, What have I now done? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him toward another, and spake after the same manner. And the people answered him again after the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be just as one of them, seeing he hath defiled the armies of the living God. And David said, Moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, Go, and the Lord be with thee. And Saul armed David with his armor, and put a helmet of brass upon his head, and armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. He took his staff in his hand, and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even in a scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David. And the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistines looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy, and of a fair countenance. And Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh to the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. And then David said unto the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defiled. This day will the Lord deliver thee into my hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee. And I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day to the fowls of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth, not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. It came to pass, when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took thence a stone and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. And therefore he ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword, drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. So this is a very familiar story. Like I said, we've all heard this a lot, but there's a lot of details in here that we kind of overlook. Just kind of wanted to look at this. And so this happens in about 1020 BC. David kills Goliath when he's approximately 15 years old. There's 3 main people in the story. That's David and Saul and Goliath. So when we look at David, we see an unlikely hero. He's the underdog of the story. We see David, he's the smallest of his brothers, the youngest one. It says that he has a fair complexion and a ruddy complexion, whatever. When it says a fair complexion, he's got smooth skin. He's not a warrior that's been out in the field and has sun bleached or brown skin from the sun and leather looking skin. He's young. And on the surface, it just don't make any sense why David would want to fight Goliath. David knows that he's the smaller guy. He knows that Goliath is a warrior and a champion. He knows all of that. But David wants to go and meet the Philistine on the battlefield anyway. It just doesn't make sense on the outward, on the surface. But then we have to keep in mind back what God told Samuel when he anointed David, was that God doesn't look at the outward appearance, he looks at the heart. So God knew that David had the heart of a warrior, and that David had the heart of a leader, and that David had the heart to do what God was asking him to do, and to be able to be successful. And God knew that David would follow after him and do what he's asking him to do. So we see that, and we see that, maybe there's other things going on in his mind, I think. It says that, just a few years earlier, he's been anointed to be the king, and he's not been told how. But maybe David saw this as an opportunity to get his foot in the door in the palace. We don't know. The Bible doesn't really tell us. But that would be a sure motivation for a young kid like that to want to go in battle. And if he knows that God is going to make him the king, he's already been anointed, then he probably figures, hey, if God's anointed me to be the king, he's going to preserve me until I'm able to take that throne. So he probably figured, hey, God's got this. God's going to look out for me and keep me safe throughout this battle. But like I say, the Bible doesn't really say that as far as his motivation. But I do believe myself personally that is part of what he was motivated by. But then we also see in the story, he was motivated by the things that Goliath said, where Goliath was belittling the Israelites and cursing God and all that stuff. And that just kind of shows some of the society that we live in as humans. It seems sad to me that Goliath was able to come out and curse God and defy God and all that. And it seems like Saul and the other soldiers that are with Saul doesn't really say anything about any of those guys getting upset over it. Don't even know if it upset anybody, if they got mad over it or not. But we see that David comes out and hears all that, and he's like, are y'all hearing this? Do y'all get what he's saying? This dog is cursing our God. And he's mad. He's fired up mad. And that's the other reason why he wanted to go out and kill Goliath, was because he was mad at the fact that his God is being belittled in front of everybody. Not just the heathen Philistines, but in front of the Israelites as well, and that nobody's doing anything about it. And he says, well, you know what? If y'all won't do it, I will. And that's kind of where he, I think that's where he mostly came from, was just that he was going to stick up for God. And he knew that God was going to stick up for him. So the other person that we see in this story is King Saul, the next person we see. And when we look at King Saul, we can look at his past, the things that he's done up to this point. Saul is a really conceited kind of a guy. He's typical kind of a king from that day and time. He's concerned about how he looks. The Bible says that he was head and shoulders above the other men of Israel. He was a big guy, tall or whatever. And by all accounts, they think he was a good-looking man. And that was what he thought a king should be. A king should look like a warrior, should be good-looking, should be a leader, all that kind of stuff. And that's what Saul pretty much was. He was more concerned about himself and doing what he wanted to do than he was concerned about doing what God had him to do. And at first he did okay with God's commandments, but then we see right before David comes on the scene here, we see that he's done wrong. He's lied about it and tried to cover it up. And God said, you know what? I'm not having that. You're not going to be my king anymore. I'm taking that away from you. So we see King Saul here. He's a very conceited man. He's full of himself, full of pride, that kind of thing. And I'm just sitting here thinking, while I'm reading through all this week, I'm sitting here thinking, that must have been pretty embarrassing for him to be looked at as the big guy. He's the one that all the Israelites are looking up to. They put all their hopes on him as the king, and they're looking for him to lead them through all this. But yet, he's not even brave enough to go and fight with the giant. Now, I get it. He's a giant, right? You don't want to go fight with a giant, but come on, that's your job. If you're going to be the leader, somebody's got to go do it. But I'm just sitting there thinking, what an embarrassment for Israel. What an embarrassment for Saul himself. And I wonder what Saul was thinking to himself while all this was going on for 40 days. I bet he felt like a coward inside, and I bet it bothered him. But then we see David come up here, and Saul has a choice. He has to choose whether he's going to let David fight Goliath or not. And you kind of wonder, well, we wondered why would David want to fight Goliath, but then why would Saul want to let David fight Goliath? There's a lot of reasons for that. Number one reason being, nobody else would do it. The other thing, and I think, and the Bible again doesn't say this, but I'm reading this into it. I believe that, back a few chapters above or before this, it says that the Spirit of God left Saul. I believe Saul understood that. He knew that. And he knew that someone else was going to be the king. So he knows the anointing has gone to someone else. The Bible doesn't tell us anywhere and say that somebody came and told Saul, hey, do you know what just happened over at Jesse's house? Samuel just went over there and anointed David to be his king. And this is the guy that's going to take your place. We don't know if Saul knew who it was or not, but we know that Saul knows somebody is going to come and take his place, and we don't know when. I imagine Saul was pretty suspicious. We know that after all the anointing left him, we know that he had some issues and all kind of things going on in his brain. He wasn't exactly right sometimes. And I'm just sitting there thinking, if Saul even had the slightest idea that David was the next one, he might have sent David over there to Goliath just to get him killed and keep him from taking the throne away from him. Again, the Bible doesn't tell us that, but I believe he either knew that David was going to be the next king, or he knew somebody was going to be the next king, and he was probably paranoid and trying to do whatever it took to maintain the throne and not to have to give it up to somebody else. So that could be a good reason, but again, the Bible doesn't tell us that, so we can't really trust that for sure. But Saul had to have some motives from somewhere. Why else would a king put the whole fate of his kingdom in the hands of a 15-year-old boy? It doesn't make sense. There had to be some reason why he thought it was a good idea to let David go. And so next we look at Goliath. We see that Goliath was perfectly prepared for this battle. Goliath, it says he was a champion of the Philistines. This is somebody that's never been beat. He's never been killed. He's the man. And he's the main man in their army. And we see that here. But in addition to that, we can see that this has been going on. God has been preparing Goliath for this day for a long time. In the book of Joshua, chapter 11 and verse 22, they're driving out the inhabitants of Canaan. And God's given them the land of Canaan. And Joshua's leading the army, and it says, and there was none of the Anakims left in the land of the children of Israel. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod there remained. So if you ever knew anything about the Bible and studied that out, what it's talking about when it says Anakims were a group of people that came from a man named Anak, and they were known to be giants. And we remember we remember when they sent the spies into the land of Canaan, and they sent 12 spies, and 10 came back and said, "Oh, there's giants. We can't go kill them." And they didn't believe it, but Joshua and Caleb were the two that came back and said, "Hey, yeah, there's giants, but we can take them." Those are the same giants that it's talking about here. And it says that Goliath, the Bible calls him Goliath of Gath. And it's funny, it lines right up, in Joshua, and it says there wasn't any more of them left in the land of Israel, but there were a remnant of them left in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. So the Anakims were a race of giants, and we see that Goliath came from that line of people, right? And those people were not killed. When they came through to drive out the inhabitants of Canaan, there were a lot of places where God told them to kill everybody and everything. But in this case, God allowed them to drive out the Anakim into these 3 towns, and it let them be there. And it says that God gave them rest from their wars. So God allowed this to happen. So God allowed Goliath's ancestors to settle in Gath, and then he knew that one day he was going to need a giant named Goliath from Gath to come and take place in this story. God's working everything. Like I said, he's working everything in the background. He's orchestrating every detail of this story. It has to be. And you think about it, years and years and years and years before this ever happened. It's crazy, but this is how God works. The Bible says that Goliath was his height was 6 cubits and a span. A cubit is 18 inches and a span is 16 inches. So Goliath was 9'6" tall. That's a big man. The coat of mail that he was wearing, it says his armor weighed like 125, 150 pounds. That's a strong man, a big, strong man. That's, and that's crazy for a little guy named David that's probably about 5 feet at the most. That's 3 or 4 feet tall. Can you imagine looking up to somebody like that? But that's the way it was. He was a man. It says that he was a man of war from his youth. That's all that Goliath had ever known. He wasn't a farmer that was called into the army. He was a warrior from his youth. Probably his dad taught him how to use a sword and how to use a shield and all those kind of weapons and stuff. And he was trained from his youth. He'd never known anything but war and fighting. That's what he was made for. You know, there were some people, I believe there's some people that are made to be just natural born leaders. There are some people that you see them in whatever job or whatever position they're in, teachers. There's some teachers that are just natural teachers. And you know when you've been around them and been in their class, okay, God made that person to be a teacher. Or God made that person to be a musician. It's the way they are. God made this man to be a warrior. So we see that. We also see that Goliath had an armor bearer that went ahead of him with a shield. So he's not only fighting a 9'6" giant, he's also fighting an armor bearer. So he's really fighting two different people here. And David knew this. And David went out, and tried to do it. So we all know how the story ends. We all know that David was successful and he killed Goliath. Not too much detail that I want to talk about there, but some lessons that we can learn from this story. I want to talk about, I wanted to talk about David this week, and there's just so much of David, and there's no way I could do it all in 1 week, but the early life of David up until the point where he kills Goliath, what are some lessons that we can learn from that? And number one, we know that David won, but it was only through God's divine intervention. He couldn't have done this on his own. There's no way. It's too much. It just couldn't happen. But there's a few things that I wrote down here, but that I want to look at. And before Saul was king, God was preparing a kingdom for David. I want you to think about that for a minute. Like I said, God is working in the background and preparing everything to happen a certain way. Israel had been ruled by a series of judges, and they said, we don't want these judges anymore. We want a king like all the other nations around us. They want to be like the other nations. So God gave them Saul, and Saul was like a lot of the other kings in that day and time. He wasn't really overly godly. He did what God told him to do for the most part, but then he started doing what Saul wanted to do. So I believe God gave them Saul for the reason that he wanted Israel to understand what it was like to live under a worldly king, because that's what they asked for. They asked for a king like all the other kingdoms. So that's what God gave them. He gave them a worldly king. And then I think that he also did that to show them what it's like to live under that worldly king. And then when he does give them a godly king in David, that they would better appreciate that. So we see that his ways are not our ways. God wanted them to understand that. Because their ways were, hey, we want to be like everybody else. But God was saying, hey, I don't want you to be like everybody else. And that's why I didn't give you a king to start with. And then we also see that God was looking at the heart. God was looking at the heart all along through the story with David, but he was also looking at Saul's heart. Saul's heart wasn't right where it was supposed to be. Again, he was a worldly king. So then when we look at David, we can see that before David was ever born, God was preparing an invincible enemy for him. God was preparing David for this situation, though. Like he said, I've fought with a lion and a bear. I've killed both of them. I've protected my father's sheep. I've protected those flocks. And he's saying that this is kind of God's way of giving David basic training for what he's going to go through as a soldier, as a warrior. They didn't know David was a warrior. They didn't know David had any bravery in him. But it takes a lot of bravery to stand up to a wild lion or a bear, especially to kill both of them. God was preparing David for this moment just like God was preparing Goliath. And so God taught him to be a leader by making him a shepherd to care for the flock. He had to lead those animals to wherever the clean water was, or wherever there was food. He had to lead them around. He had to learn how to get a heart for those animals. He had to learn to love them and take care of them and not, let anything happen to them, just like you would with people that you would lead. And he taught him, like I said, to be a courageous warrior by sending predators to him for him to defend the sheep. So then we see Goliath. When we look at him, before Goliath was born, we can see that God had a stone in a brook being prepared for Goliath. And you think about it, how long does it take for a rough, broken, jagged rock? How long does it take for that to become smooth? I don't know. The world would tell you millions of years, but I don't believe the world is millions of years old. I believe the earth is thousands of years old. And I believe that it takes a long time sitting in a brook for a rock to become smooth. It gets tumbled over. It gets bumped up against other rocks, and then the water eroding the surface of it away, and it becomes a smooth stone. And David chose 5 smooth stones. I believe God put those 5 smooth stones in that creek for David to choose at that very instant. And I believe when David had reached into his bag to grab that stone out, I believe God had a certain one that he wanted him to use. And then we can see that Goliath was physically built for this battle, obviously with his size and with his abilities. He was physically built for this. He was trained for it. Why would God do that? That's it. There's all kind of things that we don't know about why God does things, but I believe God did this because he wanted Israel to see a miracle that day. And David said it when he was talking about this. He said, I'm going to do this so that everyone will know that there is a God in Israel. That the God of Israel is the God, the only God. That's what David was saying. He wasn't saying, I'm going to do this for my own glory. I'm going to do this for God's glory. And that's one reason why God could have sent a giant like that. But I think he also wanted them to stop trusting an earthly king like Saul and put their faith into a heavenly king like David. And then we see that David was a man and David was an earthly king. But then we know the rest of the story throughout the rest of the Bible. We know that there's coming another king, Jesus, that comes to the earth, and he's literally the one that you can put your faith in. David's a human, and David will let you down. Humans will let you down. People won't follow through with stuff. But we know that King Jesus came, and King Jesus, we can put our trust in him. We can put our faith in him. So I believe those are some of the things that we see from this. We also see a lot of lessons from some of the other stories that we've looked at over the last few weeks that keep showing up from week to week. And I just think that's cool how that works out, because I didn't put any of that in here. God used the Holy Spirit and used men to write the Bible. And I just think it's cool how when we can read the stories of people that are totally different. We've studied Paul, Peter, Jonah, Noah, and David. They're nothing alike other than that they were God's man for the time. But yet there's a lot of things that we can see in each one of these stories that God has put in there for us to see. This, like I said, is another example of God working behind the scenes. That was happening in all these stories. God was using things to accomplish his purposes. And God can use people to do his purposes. Even people that aren't Christians or aren't Jews in the Old Testament, they're not trying to be used of God, but God uses them anyway, just like he did with Goliath. Goliath wasn't a godly man. He wasn't trying to be used of God, but God used him. God can call people to do things that they're not able to do. We've seen that in some of these other stories. And we've also seen how when God calls someone to do something, he does equip them to do it, just like he did with David. So God does that so that keeps us from being able to brag when we've done something. When I stand and preach, it's not me that's able to do this in my own power. I'm not good at this. I'm not able to study this. I've not been to school for this. I don't know everything there is in the Bible. But God equips me to do what I do, and God will get the glory out of it and not Nathan. It's so that he gets the glory and he gets the credit for it. And so that I can't stand up here and brag on myself about, oh, look at me, what a good preacher I am. Oh, I'm so good at this. No, I'm not. It's God. It's God is the only reason I'm able to stand here. Just like God was the only reason David was able to stand before Goliath. We see that God used people that weren't perfect. Next week, Lord willing, I'll kind of continue on with David, and we'll see some things that were in David's life that weren't right. God can use people who have problems, who have histories, baggage. You know, God can use people like that, and God can give us the grace to get by with it, to get by and to do whatever he's called us to do and to use us anyway. So just kind of in closing, what has God done in your life? What are some things that God has done through you or used you to do that you didn't think could ever be done in your life? What are some things that God's done? You know, it's just crazy what God can do with us when we're submissive to his will. And even though David was victorious in this story, he wasn't always victorious. So that's something that we need to learn and keep in mind, is that, you know, every time we come out to fight the giant, that giant doesn't fall every time. You know, David was blessed of God, and God worked and used him to defeat Goliath. And David killed other giants, you know, in his career, but, you know, those were physical giants. Those were men. There were some giants in David's personal life that he never killed. There were some giants that really wore David out in his personal life. There were some sins that David had, and there were some things that David did. All those things. Those were some giants that David never was able to defeat. And we're the same way. There are some things in our life, we're not going to win every battle. But when we don't win every battle, it's not the time to give up and give up on God. We've got to stay with God, and we're going to be victorious in the end. We're not always going to be victorious in the battle that we're fighting today. But even though we may lose some battles, one of these days we're going to win the war. And that's the important thing. So I just want to leave you with that this morning. I want to encourage you with that. Just kind of think about what David has done and all that. I wanted you to see all that. But most importantly, I want you to understand that we're not going to win every battle. We're not going to beat every giant. But that's when we've got to pray, and we've got to lean on God and put our faith in him and get closer to him. And that's when God can start really using us. So let's pray. I want to pray for our country. I want to pray for our churches. And if you would, just pray with me. Lord, I just want to come before you today and thank you for the opportunity to preach your word. I want to thank you for using me, Lord, and giving me a calling in life, a purpose in my life, Lord. I want to thank you for that. And Lord, I want to ask that you'd help all of us to find our calling. Those that don't know what it is you want them to do, Lord, that you would help them to find your calling and be able to accomplish that, Lord. Just want to ask, Lord, that you'd touch our country and Lord, help to heal our country, both physically and spiritually, Lord. Well, I ask that you'd help to take away this virus that we're under and help us to be able to get back into our churches like we want to be and be able to worship you like you would have us to do. Lord, we want to ask that you would touch each one that's watching this video. Bless each one of them, Lord. And we just pray it all in your name. Amen. Thank you, and God bless you.